Welcome to our Learn and Lunch webinar series. This webinar is part of our efforts to provide timely and relevant information to producers, lenders, and educators. This series is supported with a grant from the Farm Service Agency. And for more information, please visit our eFarm Management Training website. The address will be in a chat box in the lower right corner. Now, I will turn it over to today's speaker, Dr. Kelly Raker.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm glad you guys could join me. As you know, as some of you may know, we've done some collaborative research in the past with the Noble Foundation on this topic of cull cow management and marketing alternatives. Today I'm going to share a bit of those results with you, and some of that may be familiar to some of you, but I also want to just talk in general about what options that producers have when considering how to best market those cows that they've decided to cull from the herd. A lot of times producers, I think, don't necessarily recognize the contribution of cull cows to their annual revenue. And those cull cows are really an asset that have a salvage value. And that salvage value can represent up to 30% of the herd's annual revenue in some cases. So we want to think about how, if we're going to dispose of that asset, how can we maximize the salvage value of that asset in order to best serve our operation. So I want to talk a bit about what factors should influence a producer's decision. One, the decision to cull or to keep, and then two, once you've culled them, the decision to sell those animals immediately or to retain them and sell them at a later date. So I want to think about what some of those strategies are. The opportunity for producers really lies in the seasonality of the price index for those utility or market cows, slaughter cows. If you notice on the chart, the highest prices for utility cows tend to be in really late winter, early spring. And as you move into October, November, December, those prices are depressed, and they're depressed because most other producers are also culling their herds at the same time and marketing those cull cows. Because if you look nationwide and in the Southern Plains, the typical herd is a spring calving herd. Now that's not true for everyone, and we have some folks who don't necessarily have a defined calving season. We have some fall calving herds, but by and large, the majority of herds are spring calvers. And so when those cows are culled in the fall and all those culls hit the market, we see lower prices in the market at that time. So maybe, what does that mean for producers? Maybe we can think about doing some alternative things in terms of marketing. The decision in terms of marketing strategies for culls, it's really a multi-dimensional decision. So as I mentioned, that first decision is in fact just whether to keep the cows or not. And then once you've chosen to cull them, make that decision. Do I sell them right now? Do I retain them for later? And some of those factors that come into play in that decision are, one, what do I expect the market conditions to be? Is there a dairy buyout scheduled for February or March, and all of those culls are going to hit the market, which might change the seasonal pattern? Are there some other unique things happening in the market that might change that seasonal pattern? And the other thing to consider is cow health. Obviously, the body condition scores of those animals matter, and we'll look at that in detail later. The facilities that a producer has, the labor that he can contribute to that effort if he decides to retain. If he does decide to retain, what are the feed sources and how much are those going to cost? And then another thing to layer into that is, do you retain the cows and feed them to sell, or do you perhaps try to breed some of those back and sell them as a bred cow later? So those are all things to think about for the producer. And if we look at that first step, it's really the culling decision. And I like this quote An open cow, I don't know who to attribute it to, but I like it. An open cow to a producer is like an empty well to a thirsty man. If there's no water in the well, it doesn't help the thirsty man. And if a cow is not producing calves, then she's not contributing to the operation. And so, if one of the first steps for producers is to look to see determine which cows are open. That open cow is consuming resources and not contributing to the bottom line. That openness may signal persistent infections, and that may be venereal disease that in a herd with natural servicing that may spread among the herd then. The age of the cow certainly can come into play, the disposition, whether those younger cows are calving with ease or having a hard time. Structural soundness, can she still eat? Can she still walk? Can she still nurse a calf? And then other health issues come into play as well. So those are all the reasons that a producer might choose to cull the cow from the herd. And once that cow is culled, then the producer has to make a marketing decision. And again, the decision is, do I sell them now? And if that's a fall calving or a spring calving herd and you're selling in that fall market, do you sell them now while the prices are at their seasonal low? Or do you have the resources perhaps to retain those cows and sell them later when the prices come back up? So some of the things to think about in terms of selling now versus later. One, obviously resources. What do you think the market's going to look like? The big thing that's implied here but not explicitly written here is risk, because it's not risk-free. And we'll touch on that again in just a minute. Again, to sell now, if she can't eat, if she doesn't walk well, that's a good candidate for selling now. Those animals with higher body condition scores, those are not going to gain well in a retention setting. It costs more to just maintain that body condition, and so those are good candidates to go ahead and sell immediately on culling. Candidates to potentially retain and sell later: healthy, sound cows that can eat, that can gain, that potentially can be bred back. And those cows with lower body condition scores, it doesn't cost as much to maintain that weight to get them into the seasonal price upswing. So you've decided to retain them. So now what, right? 4 different strategies that I've laid out here. Strategy 1 would be, and you read about this a lot, particularly in the animal science, meat science literature, feed those cows to increase the quality grade of their meat and increase the value per pound. And that is the most expensive strategy. So that's something to consider. The inputs in that strategy are more expensive than for the other strategies. Strategy 2 would be to feed those animals for moderate weight gain, to simply target increasing the pounds sold. Strategy 3 is to feed those cows for minimum maintenance and hit the seasonal spring price upswing. And I don't mean just barely feed them to keep them alive, but you're not necessarily trying to add 2 pounds a day to those animals either. If you can help them just maintain their weight, but sell those pounds then at a higher price, you can potentially increase your net revenue. Strategy 4 would be to retain those cows with the bull for the possibility of selling them as bred cows. And as Dr. Peel and I like to say, the bull has to eat anyway, so perhaps that's an option for some. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about those strategies. For strategy 1, again, I mentioned there's some research in the animal science and meat science literature about this feeding to increase the quality grade and the value per pound. And it does show revenue enhancement, but a lot of those studies don't focus much on the cost of getting those animals to that quality grade. And I would venture a guess, and again, this is a guess, I've not researched it explicitly, but to increase that quality grade, I think you'd probably want a larger number of cows if you were going to take on that endeavor to make it worth your while. Dylan Fates offers a good discussion of looking at different rations and the cost of those rations with different price scenarios and different profit scenarios. The prices and costs that he uses in his fact sheet are a little dated because it's before 2010, but the concepts in that paper are really well illustrated. And so I would encourage you to take a look at his paper, and I've included the link there. But it's a good example of how to consider the cost of different rations and based on weight gain from those rations, what your net returns might look like in that case. For strategy 2, recall that strategy 2 was to feed for moderate weight gain to try to increase the pounds sold. And strategy 3 was to feed for minimum maintenance and hit the seasonal price upswing in the spring. So in essence, the collaborative work that we did with the Noble Foundation compares these two systems. Although I will say for our strategy 2, the dry lot system was probably a lower input dry lot system than some might use with strategy 2. But again, it was all feeding hay and protein all winter long. And so if we look at that in comparison to, for example, carrying cull cows on stockpiled native pasture, we can get a sense for what those different strategies might look like. This study with the Noble Foundation, we basically had 3 years of cull cows from their herds. And so this is a comparison of the average daily gain for those cows in the dry lot setting versus the stockpiled pasture setting. And you can see that we've sorted those animals by body condition score. So we considered and thin, medium, heavy. I don't know if those are exactly the right terms, but basically body condition scores of less than 4.5 we included in the thin category. Those body condition scores greater than 6 we included in the heavy or well conditioned, maybe 2 condition category, and then the rest fall into that medium category. And so if you look just at the gains in the dry lot or average daily gain, you can see that they do start off pretty even in the pasture versus the dry lot. But then once you get past December or so, they level out a bit. And you, in fact, in the pasture setting, you have some animals that really are just, in terms of daily gain, it really levels off. For those heavier animals, it really falls off. And so I just wanted to illustrate that to you. And one thing I will point out there is if you'll note that gains in general, higher in the dry lot setting, gains are higher, average daily gains are higher for those thinner cows in both settings. Now, in terms of feed cost in those two settings, you can see that the feed cost for the dry lot setting increases rapidly and is significantly higher in that setting, even though it was still what I would describe as a relatively low input dry lot setting. The costs are significantly higher per head in that setting. If we look at the native grass system, again, I would just point out those. So what we have is across time, we weighed, I should have pointed this out a minute ago, sorry. We weighed those animals monthly. So every month they were all brought in to the chute, they were weighed, they were quality graded, or they were body condition scored, and then they were put back out. And so we used those weights and scores and quality grades to ascertain prices for those animals at those different points in time. And so that's what you see here is across time, if we had marketed those animals at that point in time, the net returns, this shows the net returns that they would have put back into the operation. And so you can see that for the thin and medium, those track along fairly similarly in the native grass system. So if you held those animals till February, roughly $50 a head net returns. If you held them to March, slightly higher, closer to 60. And so for the heavy animals, really breaking even or losing money depending on the time frame there. For the dry lot system, you see a similar pattern in that chart, except that the numbers are lower, right? So the pattern is the same. The heavy animals very quickly have less returns, and in fact, in here they're highly negative in the dry lot system. And even for those thin and medium animals, they're essentially a break even in this particular study. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be true for every study. In this particular study, given prices of animals and prices of feed and stockpiled resources, that is true in this setting. The other thing that I will point out is this is a little bit unrealistic in that there's no death loss included in these estimates. We did not lose animals in the study, where in reality there's always the risk that one cow might die, two cows might die. You may have some death loss to incorporate into those net return numbers. And in this case, we did not have that. So I want to be upfront and point that out. This next slide is really the same information, just illustrated with bar charts instead. And I really put that in there just so you could take a look at it later if you want to. If I know some folks visually identify with that better than the other graphs. But it also has the feed information on this same chart for you. So this is kind of, it wraps it all together into one. But really the same outcome. You can see that in the pasture system, across body condition scores, there are positive net returns in almost every case. They are higher for the thinner animals and much lower for the heavy animals. And in the same case in the dry lot system is definitely lower for the heavy animals, but in fact they're negative for almost every scenario in that case. Now, strategy 4 begs the question of, okay, what if we're a natural service herd? What if I put my bull in with the cull cows, and what does that do for me if some of those animals are bred, and I can then market those as bred cows in the spring? And you can see that that option significantly increases the net returns per head in that case from, let's just look at January. So that's roughly probably 45 to market that animal as a slaughter animal, but 140 to market that animal as bred, $140 per head net returns. So there is a difference if you have the resources to do that. And again, that also brings in some additional costs that I don't believe are included in here, which would be checking those cows. That cost is not taken out, I believe. If we look at, this is in the dry lot system, again, in that dry lot system, it then becomes profitable to retain those animals if you can market them as bred animals. Okay, so the big picture, sort of, then why do I always retain them? If you're showing me that I can throw them out in the pasture, they can graze on some forage, I can throw some cubes and hay at them when it's, when we have winter weather, are they always going to be profitable? Well, no. I think there's some evidence that can be a good way to retain them, but every producer has different resources. If you've got some hay that really needs used up and it's not the highest quality, that might be a good use for that, is to retain some of those animals on hay through the winter. It's a year-to-year decision. You've got to look at your resources. You've got to look at the market conditions. We had some years there as herds were expanding where we didn't really see that seasonal dip in the fall. And in fact, the slaughter prices were more level, and so in that year it might not have paid to actually hold on to those cows because you didn't get that seasonal upswing because prices were already higher in the fall. And so there are situations where you would not choose to retain any, even though you might have some thinner ones that would gain well. Perhaps the market conditions suggest that you go ahead and market those now. But the other suggestion I would say, though, is that your higher body condition scored cows Those that are in good condition but open for some reason, those typically are not going to be profitable for retention because they require higher feed inputs simply to maintain that body condition score. And so they're not necessarily putting it to weight gain. And so your returns are likely going to be less from those animals. The other suggestion was sometimes just find an inexpensive way to feed the rest of those. Between the thin and medium body condition scores, there wasn't much difference in net returns. In our scenario, and again, I emphasize in our study, and it was one study across 3 years, so it's not the be all end all. But in that particular study, retaining those animals on native grass, even though they didn't gain as well, it was more profitable than retaining those animals in a low-cost dry lot setting. The highest returns that we saw were in that 90 to 150 day period, so 3 to 5 months on native grass. And then again, I would point out that if there's the potential to perhaps breed back some of those animals, you could market those as bred as potential replacements into fall calving herds or year-round herds. So there is some potential there. And again, the bull has to eat regardless of where you keep him. So if you've got some culls that you'd like to try to breed back, he might as well eat with them. So I've got some references I've included just to point you to some other resources that we have. And I'll just leave those there for you to use. And then I know there's a webinar survey that Brent would like you to complete, and he will visit with you a little bit about that. So that's all I have. If you have questions, I would be happy to take them. I see that Brent's included the survey link down here in the chat, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you all for filling out the survey. We appreciate your feedback and input on that. I would like to remind you all of our next webinar, which will be an income tax update by J.C. Hobbs on July 11th, and it will also be at noon. So if there are no other questions, we will end our webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just offer that if you think of questions later, certainly feel free to contact me, and I'm happy to share resources with you anytime.